I'm a Welsh noble, I mobilise Wales against the English. Owain Glyndŵr fought King Henry IV because Wales abhorred English rule. It's not unusual, but my uprising, it went a bit wrong, and this song tells the surprising tale. Owain Glyndŵr, Welsh hero of the hour. It all began.
Croeso, welcome to Tales for Wales. We are back with Glyndŵr Part 3, and you've reached our lovely little pit stop, designated pit stop.
A little breather.
A little story pit stop for us, where we're going to have a little chat and a debrief before we get into the full-blown Part 3 of the epic saga that is Glyndŵr. I'll just jump right in, shall I? Give you my little 2 pence worth? Excellent, mate. Where's the film? I want the film made right fucking now.
Sorry, let me just reply angrily to Dan 1 second. Sorry.
Sorry. So it's something more important's come up.
All right, sorry. I'll pick my phone away.
Just pick up where it was. Yeah, it's got the makings of such a like a historic epic, doesn't it? Like a Kingdom of Heaven, like a Braveheart sort of stuff.
Yeah,
like it's got this. It's even the setup's like cinematic. Like you can visualize the story beats in the film.
Yeah,
do you know what I mean?
I think you can I constantly can see so many, especially when I finish the whole thing. By the end of it, maybe at the very end we can do like a recap as well and see like what you see the beats of being. But I can smell it because it's like visceral. I can think, you can picture the scenes where like they're trying to go up the hill. Pichleth trying to bring glass, trying to get the horses to go up the hill, but their hooves get stuck in the mud, and you just see how muddy and grimy and grim.
Or even the sort of the political scenes, if you like, with the interplay between the English lords and Henry and all that sort of stuff. You can definitely see that put onto screen. I love the image of Glyndŵr climbing the craggy cliff, and all that sort of stuff. Older gentlemen, Owain Lloyd, climbing the craggy cliff. And
Great,
I like that.
Yeah. I do think so. The next one there we talk about this is probably the height. So we're going to go in that. We're the 3rd out of 5 parts, and we're going to enter
the golden age of the rebellion.
And what really sets them apart from others. So like I mentioned before, no one rebels for 2 years or 3 years. The fact this is this lasts for over a decade is so unheard of. But this is a slightly shorter episode, and it will focus a little bit. It'll set the groundwork to some of the mad, crazily historic things that happen, and because of the Welsh, it's one of the most important battles on British soil happens in the next episode. But what we're going to do here first is talk about more Glyndŵr's political nous and how good he is at how better he is than some of the other past.
He was a fighter. He was a thinker. He was a
talker.
He was a
he had
lover.
7 kids as well.
And he was a yapper. He was a right laugher. In between these massive historic monumental things. He's I just need to get my end away one more
that's
time.
The thing. He was old, so he had 7 adult children. He had lots of sons, daughter. He was proper. He's a man who knows he probably will die soon, and he will die of old age, not die from the sword.
Yeah.
He's old.
He's made it long enough.
Ass.
He's beat the census. Yeah.
But this one, we're going to start off with the penal laws against the Welsh. So,
penis laws.
You
said there'd be a bit of banter this episode. You said we could do this.
But you've also seen what I've got written down here coming up as well. So I'll go from my notes anyway. So now we're back for part 3. I thought it would help cover the backdrop of what the English are doing to try and stifle this rebellion. And it won't surprise you to know that they didn't offer much carrot. Instead, they were pretty happy to smash the old brutal stick to whip the Welsh into a submission. So when the rebellion was in full swing, Henry IV introduced several penal laws against the Welsh. And yes, Jack, before you make any cock jokes about the word penal, I thought I'd explain what they are. The laws about your willy. Nah, joking.
See,
This
is how linked we are, mate. Our brains are just operating on the same wavelength these days.
Yeah, but if we're being serious, the discriminant laws aim to regulate behaviour and suppress control. Okay,
this is when the rebellion reaches apex, when they start making rules about boys' knobs, because we are not having that.
Yeah, we ain't having that. Historically, penal laws were referred to as discriminatory laws against specific religions or ethnic groups. In this case, they were made against the Welsh, and the penal laws of 1402, they passed through the English Parliament to firm up English domination in Wales. But these did the opposite. They only succeeded in pushing more and more Welshmen into Glyndŵr's camp. Oh, matron.
So we are allowed banter this episode.
Yeah, we are. Well, there's a bit of bounce here. What did these laws include? I hear you whimper as you goon to Welsh history.
Oh.
They were enforced by Henry IV and V, and these laws, they banned Welsh people from bearing arms or holding public office. They forbade them from living in fortified towns. They made it illegal for the Welsh to purchase land in English boroughs. They forbade Welshmen from serving on juries involving Englishmen. They barred Welsh clergy from being promoted in the church. Even English men married to Welsh women could lose their rights. Places like Chester and Ludlow had several laws against the Welsh. Welshmen were banned from Chester and could be beheaded without trial. If a Welshman was there after dark, you could kill him without trial. It was legitimately dangerous to be Welsh at this time. And you know, like now, far-right people say, you can't be English anymore, not in Starmer's Britain. Well, that was the case. In the
you literally could not be Welsh,
In the 1400s, it was dangerous. You could be killed for being Welsh. In the same year, the penal laws come into force. As we mentioned last week, Owain laid an ambush to capture his arch-enemy Baron de Grey Ruthin during a skirmish. So when he brought that amazing... That was a scene that would have been
one of my favourite bits of the story so far. It's like, that's such a good character moment in this proposed film that we're imagining, because it's like, the bastard de Grey has come back. It's like, we'll have it.
And he ended up getting over 11,000 marks for it. And I've researched what this meant in context. So in the early 15th century, a highly skilled craftsman would earn around £3 to £5 a year, making 10,000 marks, more than 1,000 times the annual income. And what was the purchasing power? Like, what does that mean? Yeah. So such a sum could fund a massive military campaign, like hugely. He could pay for everything he needed. He could buy mercenaries. He could buy armor. He could buy food. For comparison, £1,000, so not marks, was a massive sum in the 1400s. So 10,000 marks, roughly £6,666, was just such a big amount of money for one man's life. And he was doing this a lot. He was like capturing nobles and then selling them back to the English.
I'm assuming normally lesser degrees than de Grey, but still worth a pretty penny. But then when you got de Grey, it was like fucking huge payday, baby.
Yeah. And as we mentioned last week, we discussed the Battle of Brynglas. But to quickly sum it up, 22nd of June, 1402, Glyndŵr defeated the English force led by Sir Edmund Mortimer near Pilleth in Powys, with modern estimates suggesting Glyndŵr commanded around 2,000 men. 1,500 to 2,500. I say 2,000. That's the remit you could go right against, compared to Mortimer's slightly larger of around 3,000 men. But the Welsh were split into two, with one set of soldiers hiding in the tree line, and then the archers turning into spearmen at the top. The English, not seeing the hidden troops, advance up the hill in the Welsh positions, where longbow completely disrupted their formation before the Welsh concealed attack. Horses got fucked by the English. Horses couldn't go up the hill. Welsh cavalry decimated them. Likely, nearly all of the English pretty much died. Then there was compounded reports about defections from the Welsh archers in the English service, triggering this huge collapse. Massive rout on a hill. It's one of the biggest wins Glyndŵr ever had. And like I mentioned last week, there are stories of women chopping off the English tallywhackers and popping them in the gob of the English, which was like revenge for the rape and murder of the English.
Not in their gobs.
Right in their Franny! Owain offered to release Mortimer for a really large sum. So similarly to to Lord Grey, he was like, I've got... and also, I didn't say this very well in the last episode, but Edmund Mortimer was such a big, pivotal English noble.
Huge family, when they massive influential.
And they put a huge ransom on him. But But in contrast to the attitude of de Grey, which Henry IV paid pretty quickly, they didn't do that for Mortimer. And the reason for that was because Mortimer's nephew was said to have more or greater claim to the English throne than Henry himself. So a speedy release for him wasn't really that ideal for Henry IV.
I've heard this, that it's like you could potentially be giving in a usurper a kind of a chance,
And Glyndŵr kind of twigged onto this. So he negotiated with Mortimer and ended up marrying Mortimer to his own daughter. And he was like, right, fuck that. The English aren't doing great here. Marry into my family and you'll be released and all this stuff. And Mortimer was like, actually, I'm disillusioned by the fact my king won't look after me. Why did I do this fight for him if you weren't even going to help me?
Yeah.
And then he ended up marrying Glyndŵr's family and brought into the campaign and brought all of his men to fight for Glyndŵr.
Was Glyndŵr's daughter in this? Is it Catrin?
There is a Catrin, yeah. Yeah, I think there is a Catrin.
I don't know if it's that the one that married Mortimer. I'm sure Catrin just came up in my head for some reason.
Let me have a quick check, because I do think... Yeah, his daughter was, Catrin Mortimer. Yeah, she changed her name to Mortimer.
See,
God, you're good.
On a long enough time scale, the knowledge just seeps in.
Yeah. But, so, where are we here? So it's kind of like shows his nuances as a leader. It's like, well, all right, you're not being paid back quickly enough. Maybe they would have brought Mortimer back, but it wasn't the same speed that they got de Grey back. So he then was like, well, fuck it, marry into my family and you'll never go hungry in my kingdom again.
There's another scene you can imagine in like a dungeony, prisony cell.
Yeah, exactly. Coming in like a dripping
why
dungeon.
are you fighting for a king that doesn't value you, doesn't pay you? Marry my fine as fuck daughter. And you
get my beautiful daughter.
Yeah.
And these series of events make Brynglas or Pilleth, that battle at Pilleth, one of the most decisive battlefield victories the Welsh had ever had in their history. And it was a major boost to the fight for freedom. Like, not only did they beat a much bigger army, a bigger army, but it was led by one of the best generals in England. And now they turned that general into an ally. And also in that year, they so it's the same year they sent another hugely costly royal expedition to Wales. But now, so Glyndŵr is not just fighting like guerrilla styles, he's doing pitched battles against them. He's like, right, I will fight you, but I'll fight you where I know how to win. We start hearing about the bloody frogs, the old ribbit, the French.
the old web-footed French. I got you.
And another one of Owain's daughters, Janet, she'd been sent to Flanders and was negotiating on the continent for her father for 2 years, so up until 1404. Like, Glyndŵr was like, his kids were fucking world class. They were his sons fought, and we'll talk more about one of his sons later. But his wife, his daughter, so his wife Madaged, his Catrin Mortimer became like a big part of her. They all have a role to play, and it's pretty fucking cool that all of them were like,
it's like a dynasty, isn't it?
So like I mentioned, Janet had been over in France negotiating and kind of like spreading the word. We're now into the 4th year of this massive rebellion, which we won't even call a rebellion at this stage. It's now like a nation has been born. And Glyndŵr sent more envoys to France in 1404 to the French courts and negotiated this thing called the Treaty of Alliance with Charles VI of France. I remember in the last episode I mentioned about letters being sent over.
Yeah.
The letters to the Scots and the Irish were intercepted, but they managed to get quite a lot over to France. And it's not too hard to get from Wales to France by boat. And it's probably easier than going up to the Irish Sea and going up to Scotland. So in 1405, so this agreement, the Treaty of Alliance in 1404, was the French had agreed to send aid to Glyndŵr and his Welsh followers in the rebellion against King Henry IV. So they were going to send like what they needed. They were more than happy to kind of get involved. And it started to cement 1405 as being the height of Glyndŵr's power. So he's like the French. He's got the French on side. He's like had these big wins. He did all these certain things, right? So we'll discuss
all these like messianic kind of thing, like symbolisms going for him, and
he got the locals, he got the bards, he got the nobles, he got and like he'd done Wales, and now he's called international baby. And there's so much so that in 1405, the French actually sent soldiers to come help. And they met the Welsh, and from here, they taught them, the French did this thing that Wales had never been able to do. They taught them how to build and operate siege weapons. And it's worth noting that during the rebellion, Glyndŵr was mostly laying siege to castles rather than fighting pitched battles. But like laying siege is one thing. but being able to use siege weapons is something we'd never ever done before. We didn't really have like Llewellyn Fawr tried a few times, but the French, who were masters at it, we learned how to operate and construct siege machinery, and they had these master craftsmen from France come to Wales and teach them how to do
like
it.
Absolute upgrade our forces.
Yeah. Although annoyingly, this is towards the end of like sieges. It's the end of like trebuchets, and it's the start of the cannon. And Glyndŵr never really had access to cannons. But a French expeditionary force of roughly 3,000 troops, which included men at arms and crossbowmen, they landed in southwest Wales, and either near like roughly around Milford Haven, and they joined Glyndŵr's forces, and they created a combined army that now reached around 10,000 men and 10,000 fighting men. This allied army advanced through East Pembrokeshire and into Glamorgan, and they captured and raided fucking loads. So all over from Pembrokeshire down to Glamorgan. They got Haverfordwest. They got Carmarthen, which is this fucking jewel. They even made all the way to Cardiff. All
these like embedded martial lands and martial cities. Sort of thing,
and like Carmarthen was such a trade town. Me and Jack are going there for the next road trip actually, so we'll do a lot more about that. But this is like really important. Like Glyndŵr was making alliances with one of the world's superpowers, and now seen as like a legitimate ruler. Like France is one of the big dogs, and they've been seen as like this huge. They see Glyndŵr as an actual person to work with. And then from there, another massive battle Glyndŵr wins is at Battle of Starling Down. And there isn't a huge amount of accurate records for this, or even specifically what year it happened. But it was part of Glyndŵr's ransacking of the Vale of Glamorgan. And the French joined, and they helped besiege. So the French joined from Haverfordwest, and they now besieged the incredibly rich town of Carmarthen. And then after they let some of the French just stay and besiege it, whilst Glyndŵr took a lot of the men down the old Roman road going to Cardiff and Newport. And Cardiff and Newport are like the heart of martial lands in South Wales. They are so enshrined in Norman.
Super rich as well.
Super rich. Port towns. And on the way, they attacked and besieged Llandow Castle, the walled Bastide of Cowbridge. They took over Flemington Castle, Dunraven, St Quentin Castle, Llanquain Castle, and they even destroyed the West Orchard Castle in St Athod, your old stomping ground. They destroyed like 400 years nearly of martial rule. They burnt down farm buildings in Blackhall. They destroyed the 19th chamber at Ogmore Castle. So if you ever go to Ogmore Castle, where we're like literally 5 minutes from where I live, the chamber outside the castle is in ruins, and that's from Glyndŵr and his men. And all these places were like, they were so important to the marshes and the Norman strongholds for centuries that they were now completely ablaze and costing the crown thousands in unearned tax and economic turmoil. But more than that, it's symbolic. It's like how big this war was, that Glyndŵr managed to overthrow or burn down these physical and metaphysical representations of like
that like
repression.
Foothold that they've been there in Wales since, just after the Normans landed in the UK, basically, and then suddenly all of a sudden he's lifting the foot off and just burning everything down. It's class.
I'm going to say a word that gave me a semi earlier. A Franco-Welsh army. Which Franco-Welsh army. Yes, please.
You fucking loved that,
But by late 1405, the Franco-Welsh army pushed deep into southeast Wales, and eventually, this is nuts, man, they invaded England. They took enough men. They start the invasion of England. Here, they faced a royal English force led by Henry IV and his son, future King Henry V. So Hal and Henry were both there. And Glyndŵr was there with his army of around 10,000 French Welshmen, and Henry IV was there with roughly, you'd assume a similar size or bigger. The two sides manoeuvred around Worcester, and they went to a place called Woodbury Hill. And they shadowed each other for around a week, just as winter was coming, so in October in 1405. So these two massive armies, 10,000 minimum on either side, but no pitched battle ended up taking place, mostly due to Welsh supply issues and huge caution by the English. The difficulty of forcing like a combat of 20,000 men fighting each other is,
how do you even? Logistically must be a nightmare.
And winter's coming, and you're on a hill where Wales fucking dominates. So the Welsh planted themselves on a hill in England, and they were like, right, we're settled here, but then they lost supplies. They're like, oh fuck.
It's like if you had the great supply chain still going, you'd be like, we'll wait them out, wait the English out, but. Yeah, you don't. As the English, you wouldn't want to make that first move, would you? Especially like off the back of like a Bringlass sort of defeat.
Exactly. But Glyndŵr was like, no, come on, let's fucking tease them. And he started sending smaller groups to ambush them at night, to attack them at night and like just cause havoc.
I love being such a pain in the ass. Like,
yeah. And there was reports of daily skirmishes back and forth, and then the English would do the same. And they faced each other for over a week. It was about 8 days, and there was like it was just constantly back and forth, like trying to find a weakness where they could go in. But you have these two hills adjacent to each other, and neither of them want to make the first move because the Welsh couldn't afford to fuck this up. It's them done. Yeah. But for the first time ever, a Welsh army had literally gone to invade England. It just so happened that the English king and his prince were there with all of his best soldiers, which kind of scuppered it a little bit. But an informal truce was agreed between Henry and Owain. People dispute this, but there was also historians who say they agreed that because you can't just let an army walk away, especially when it's kind of come in. But for the first time in nearly 4 centuries, Wales had a big enough army to face the King of England in an open pitch battle. But provisions ran low. Winter approached. The French were like, we have to go back. They started sailing back to France, and Glyndŵr's forces were like, we have to go back to the field. We have to like get all this shit in. Because also, we forget about this. Food wasn't at a supermarket. You have to pull in your crops, and most of the people fighting for Glyndŵr were farmers.
Yeah, it's a whole supply line, isn't it? It's just
So the Welsh withdrew, but the campaign, it was significant because it marked such a high point of international support for Glyndŵr and just demonstrated that his revolt was becoming part of a European conflict. It wasn't like a homegrown battle. It was now a European. This is a nation versus a nation, not rebellion. However, a failure to force a decisive battle or secure lasting territorial control meant it didn't change the overall trajectory of the rebellion, but it was generally considered the high water mark. And I'm going to go back a little in time now and talk about the third royal expedition, just to cover some interesting bits, right? Just to talk about the money. I quite like the facts and the figures. I think it brings it to life, doesn't it?
Especially when you compare it to like modern day sort of equivalents.
But so the third one expedition, like I mentioned earlier, was Lord Grey was sneaking around and going to Henry V. He was like, "Come on, let's do this." So that secret royal expedition was led entirely by the king's sons of Henry V. And the records they still have in England state that around wages stating £8,000, which is roughly £8 million today, were paid to 4 barons, 20 knights, 476 squires, 2,500 archers, and around overall 30,000 men. So they got 30,000 soldiers to come and attack Wales. So Henry marched into central Wales from Shrewsbury, and the Earls of Warwick and Stafford and Arundel, which is no longer a Camote, but Arundel, and to strike South Wales from Hereford. When the prince made it to North Wales, there was little opposition as the men had already been with Glyndŵr and were raiding elsewhere, so there wasn't many people there. But then this led to a huge amount of killing, looting, and then rape of a load of Llanrwst. They tried to blame on Glyndŵr for the first part because the rape was apparently beyond what Wales had seen. It wasn't just it was meant to be like, it was systemic and it was brutal, beyond brutal. And they try to pin it on Glyndŵr, but obviously everyone was like, why would he do that?
It's all been applied, this entire rebellion.
And it forced more of them to be, they couldn't believe how brutal it was. The abbey at Mennan was looted and burned, and because the abbot was openly a supporter, they hung like religious people. And it was all like beyond something they'd seen. So Glyndŵr heard about how bad it was and harried all of his soldiers, raced to face Harry and Prince Hal and the enemy. He got as many people as he could because he was like, "Fuck, you are now destroying." This is like beyond. This is the rape of a nation. So, but he knew he couldn't take the army on a pitched battle with his war party. So instead, he ambushed and attacked throughout the nights, and he was like furious. And he set up, before I mentioned war bands, he had like these war bands. Like, he had loads of them set up all along the camps, and everywhere the English were, he'd have like
anytime they step
men,
anywhere out of the beaten path, he'd fight.
And it was like frenzied. So like they'd go in with knives and like short swords and no armor, and go in and fucking just hack the shit out of them. And it was their English records describe it as completely frenzied. And they also record that a storm brought a tornado on the 7th of September during this invasion from the English, but at the same time the Welsh were going fucking nuts in retaliation, and it was so bad. And this is a quote from a chronicle at the time: "It threw down the king's lances and pierced armour. This huge wind blew down Henry's tent and inflicted such damage that had the prince not been sleeping in his armour, he would have been killed, crushed by a giant tent pole." And despite this being the summer, this is at the summertime, a storm came around. Like it was like they weren't expecting this weather at all.
Yeah.
It just led to so much prophecy around Glyndŵr being able to command the elements.
I've heard that bit before. I think we touched on that before. I can't remember what episode it was, but yeah, about Henry. Like if the tent had come down on him without his armor, he would have been crushed and killed. Well, what a like that sort of decisive moment in history. Like imagine he just gone, "I'll take the breastplate off tonight." Dead.
Well, Glyndŵr really did lean into this kind of pagan stuff. And there's a thing called, he actually wore a magic raven stone. People believed he wore it around his neck that made him invisible. And in the Annals of Henrica Quarti, which is the contemporary historical notes written, like the Annals of Cumbria, the historians at the time will write about the person in charge, and they wrote this around Henry IV, and it records Glyndŵr has almost destroyed the king's army by using magic alone. But this third expedition that came in, Glyndŵr had raised so many of these war bands that he was actually beating an expedition because of the tactics he employed. But they describe it as being able to control the elements. And it's a quote from it that's been translated from Latin that says, "From the time they entered Wales to the time they left, never did a gentle air breathe on them, but throughout the whole days and nights, rain mixed with snow, and half afflicted them with cold beyond endurance." And this is again this is like September, and it's like snow and rain.
It's like an unbelievable sort of thing that's happened. Yeah, I love it. This is roughly the same time when this comet went across, and they saw it as this Brythonic legend coming to beat the Saxons. I love it, man.
And the literature described him, they described Glyndŵr as being something more than human, which I think is so cool. He's beyond. He's like they described that in Heart of Darkness, the book that they wrote. That that film that's based in what's it called? What's that American film where they're in Vietnam? Apocalypse Now.
Apocalypse Now, yeah.
The guy who's like the baddie in there. It's based on a book called The Heart of Darkness, right? And in
Marlon Brando. Is that it?
Yeah,
I know he's in it, but.
In the book version, right, they had this guy who goes to Africa, and he meets a local tribe, and he kind of becomes like a god amongst them. And they describe him as he kicked himself loose of the earth, and that's saying he's no longer earthly bound. And they say that about Glyndŵr, something
divine
more than human.
Something divine, divinity and whatever.
So this third expedition, the English couldn't really do much, so they were getting massacred in open fields. And in the forests and in the ravines and in the valleys. So they're like, right, we have to re-garrison ourselves, and they just put all their soldiers in really important castles of Harlech, Caernarfon, Beaumaris, to stop them falling into Welsh hands. And they had to pretty much leave empty-handed yet again because there was nothing left to plunder in Wales. So following this royal expedition, Glyndŵr would attend. So once the army had gone and they just left the garrisons, Glyndŵr would attend the funerals of all these local peasants who'd been murdered. And it's the first time he was coming back into the public fold.
Yeah.
But he was and he was putting himself at risk of assassination, which had happened a few times. He'd been tried to be assassinated, but he started attending them, and it just cemented him further into the hearts of the Welsh. So he'd turn up.
He's a man of the people.
Yeah, and at the same time, right. So this thing happened in Scotland. There was Scotland in the north. The Scots were fighting in the north of England, in Northumberland, which is the land of the powerful Percys. The Scots had attacked, and there was this big battle called the Battle of Humbleton Hill. And the Scots had loads of nobles at this battle, and they got decimated. A Scottish chronicler wrote of the English bowmen, this is fucking sick, although sad, but sick. The English bowmen, advancing on the Scots, smothered them with arrows and made them like bristles like hedgehogs, transfixing their arms and hands to their own lances and spears. So they couldn't even move from how much they were stuck in there. But the Scots were very sympathetic to Glyndŵr, and it might have been that they were trying to come down to help Glyndŵr at the same time. So they were going to harry England from the north and support Glyndŵr.
Split the forces and whatnot, yeah.
Yeah, and that's when the Scottish Chronicler wrote that thing I read in the previous episode about the Britons shall flourish. You know, that thing
definitely sounds like they were keen for some sort of allegiance there, doesn't it? Like, and if that letter had got to them, they seemed up for it. They were primed for it.
But yeah, the guy fighting them was the Percy. So he won this massive battle. He took over loads of the Scottish kings, like nobles and sons. And so Percy won it, and he did it for the crown. And the idea was, whenever you win these things, you don't kill the nobles. You capture them, and then you ransom them back. And that's how you make your money. And that's always been the way, even against like pure, like De Grey we mentioned, they still ransomed him back despite him being an absolute bastard.
We mentioned it recently with the Declares Part 2 as well, wasn't it? One of the last living Declares, he was fighting up in Scotland, and he was killed because he wasn't sporting his coat of arms, basically. Yeah. If he had been, they probably wouldn't have killed him. They'd have just captured him because he was worth a lot of money.
Well, so he captured loads of nobles, sons and nobles, but Henry didn't want to pay Percy to ransom him, so he was like, no, fuck it. And he refused to allow them to be ransomed.
Henry.
You know, which meant the debt owed to the Percys was absolutely massive. And due to them fighting the Scottish and now the Welsh on behalf, it meant the debt wasn't going to be cleared and they'd have zero money from this battle. They just did this, like genuinely, this battle at Stambolton Bridge, Humbleton Hill. This battle there was such a decisive win, and it pretty much took out all royalty in Scotland. Later on, I'll talk about what happened to that king. He says one of the funniest things ever about how that battle affected him. But but nothing was to show for Percy for winning this, and Hotspur for being this leader of the charge and all this stuff.
So what is his beef with Hotspur? Because it seems like Hotspur is like absolutely digging in and
do you know sometimes
best.
when someone's too powerful or might be too good, it's like, hang on, you're the one winning all my battles and you've got power in the north. Do I really want to give you
almost
more
like don't
power?
Want to enable you?
Exactly.
Because you might someday. The irony that if you treated him well, he probably wouldn't turn against you.
Because he's doing this stuff for you already, and he could turn against you. But let's park that for a second, because that has massive implications about what's to come. But we'll head back to Wales. So now we're at the end of 1403, and so it's going back in time a little bit from the last episode, but we've had, like I mentioned, this third expedition. I am jumping around times a little bit, but this is all around...
It's a story, mate.
Yeah, and 1405 is around the height, but 1403 up to there gets him to the height. So by now, 1403, all the major castles were essentially under siege and most were captured. So 1403 is the lead up to Glyndŵr. By 1405 and 1406, he's bossed it. But like I mentioned, this Humbleton Hill happened. 1403, all of Glyndŵr's men had all the major castles either essentially captured or under siege. And that lists Aberystwyth, Harlech, Connaught, Criceth, Carnarvon, Beaumaris. These are like, the biggest castles in Europe. And the way they did it was so interesting because the French had come over and helped them for a lot of it. The French had taught them to build sows, which are shielded domes made of hides, where the miners would dig underneath the wall to collapse them. So they'd have these big hides over there. Instead of doing battering rams, they just dig the ground underneath these like stone castles. They'd fall. And then they would use Greek fire, which was naphtha and petroleum, and was highly flammable and was really difficult to extinguish. And even if you pour water on it, it would spread more like a grease fire. As they launched these vases and pots over the walls on any timber structures. And this is the stuff the Byzantine Empire used in like the 7th century onwards. It was horrific.
Right.
It was like cook you alive.
Like early day napalm, basically.
And you couldn't get rid of it. Like if you threw water on it, it just literally spits it on. And they'd also burn pig carcasses to create really thick smoke to cause as much chaos as possible, which creates like a really visceral battle scene, doesn't it? And and Glyndŵr's armies were mostly around sieging places. Like I mentioned, they either do ambushes or they're sieging somewhere. And with swelling support, Owain captured the mighty Harlech Castle in 1404. And it was built by Edward I to symbolise dominance. Harlech Castle they describe it as an English island in a Welsh sea because it's on the very coast.
Just about to say that is a huge, like, symbolic thing as well. Because it's a lovely castle. If you ever get a chance to see it, it's great.
Amazing.
But it is sort of tinged a little bit. It was like, this was Edward I's one. He tried to model it off a description of Camelot, if I remember correctly. Yeah,
that's cool.
ironic. He was obsessed with like the stories of King Arthur, even though he's like a Brythonic, original kind of Brythonic hero or whatever. But yeah, apparently he based it on his idea. I think it was Camelot or one of King Arthur's castles. But
I'd actually say, what's your favourite castle in Wales? Because that's mine.
Tough. It's really tough.
I think Harlech is mine. I visited Dynevor, right, and I thought it was amazing. I went to visit Harlech, and it was during half term, and there was so many Brummies and Manx, and people were like, I couldn't hack it, so I actually didn't go in. But I thought the setting was so fucking cool, and the fact it's like a gateway to Ireland and stuff.
I think because I haven't seen some of the ones I really want to, like, I'd love to go and see Dynevor.
You're not Dynevor, yeah.
And Castell Carrickeenan.
Well, we're going to do Kidwelly as well, aren't we, on the way up to
Kidwelly Castle would be really cool. I think I've been there when I was really young.
I've been there when I was young.
How the ones I've seen, I really like. I like Carnarvon. That was
Conway is sick as well.
Yeah, I don't think I've been to Conway, actually.
That's a really good. And Conway Town's class. It's like a walled city as well, walled town. So it's got like the wall all around and then the castle.
I've seen a lot of castles that are like in ruins, like loads of. So there's so many around Wales, isn't there? But like, so the one in St Athan is in ruins, Fonmon's in ruins. Like I've seen all those around there.
You've been to Caerphilly, haven't you?
Yeah, Caerphilly's class.
I've not done Caerphilly.
That was De Clare that made that, wasn't it? Who commissioned that? But yeah, that Caerphilly's class, that is huge.
Second biggest in Britain, and even the one above it, Windsor, which isn't really even a castle.
Yeah, exactly. It's rubbish.
Anyway, should I go back to the?
Yes, get back to it. Yeah, we can talk about castles later,
and I'll talk more about the conquest later. About like how. Yeah, a bit more about like how Glyndŵr did all this, but it's really important to note that this wasn't just like a military victory, like I mentioned. This is so symbolic that like Glyndŵr he was the Prince of Wales, taking over these castles that have been built by the man who destroyed Welsh nationality and independence.
Subdue his people.
And his ambition grew far beyond military conquest. So in the same year that he took these in 1404, he conveyed the very first Welsh Parliament. He did that at Machynlleth. There, he laid out his grand vision for an independent Wales, which is sick. And I'll talk a lot more about this over the next few episodes. But it included rebuilding the Church of Wales, so no longer a Church of England, new universities, a robust foreign policy, things about all that. But I'm going to talk way more about that later on. But just bear that in mind. This is like he's finally, so 4 years into the rebellion, he's had huge victories. He's beaten the odds. He's actually now thinking, I'm no longer just fighting. I'm now thinking, how do I like build this into a nation?
Yeah, how do I
he
build
creates
Wales
a great
back, yeah.
seal. He, like you have your own great seal. He builds his own great seal. He creates his own great seal, and it's a powerful symbol used in all of his official documents which he sends across all of Europe. He sends it to Rome. He sends it to France, Germany, or what is modern day Germany, and they convey a clear message. This is a man who could not only fight, but he could also govern. There's a professor. One of the theses I read was from a guy called Michael Livingston. He said, the vision of Owain Glyndŵr and his new Wales is something that I think really sets him apart from other rebels. It's the one thing to try and take power, but quite another to know what to do with it when you have it. So by now, Cardiff, Caernarfon, Caerphilly, Newport, Usk, even frigging Dinas Powys. Can you imagine that? Dinky Poo has been done, had been completely sacked. Glyndŵr at this point virtually controlled all of Wales, except for a few castles in northeast Pembroke. So he controlled pretty much all of Wales. The biggest castles in all of Wales, they were now gone. He was in charge of them. The only ones he didn't were in Pembroke, which we mentioned a few episodes ago, the Lanskar very, 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 very much a Norman or Flemish town. But the reason why, because they were paying him not to attack. And so they were like,
yeah, that's it. You get money out of it anyway, so that's fine. Yeah, as you said, the Lanskar episode, it's like these guys were so rich.
They could just pay you off.
They just pay you off.
He needed that. He needed to make money. And he had all the other castles under siege. So he had like Dynevor Castle, one of the best castles in Wales, which was under siege for so long, and he was constantly trying to get help. And they had like an escape
tough
route,
siege that is as well, I imagine, because it's where it is.
Well, yeah, he like they were trying their best to get like access to help from there, but they wouldn't. They couldn't even get resupplied. But it's also pretty much impregnable. It's a castle on the very top of the Towy Valley and stuff like that.
It's like on top. It's like literally on a cliff edge, isn't it?
It's gorgeous. Yeah,
it's a really cool looking castle. But what makes it so like almost unsiegeable? because you can only really approach it from one direction, also means that if you're being sieged, it's really difficult to fuck off out of there, isn't it? Because it's like on the edge of a cliff.
And I went there hungover with my mate Coxie and Fletcher, and it genuinely is so sick, and it's like it's bizarre. It looks like a big like furnace. It's got a big like circular thing, but anyway, Glyndŵr was trying to fight there. His men held it in a siege for so long, but they didn't get resupplied. Or normally, if you held a castle, you either take it after sieging it for a while, or it gets resupplied and held off. And Dynevor was so expensive and important, but the English didn't come to help it, and it just it kind of symbolised that they were on their own in this new Wales that had kind of like been taken over by Glyndŵr. Yeah. So, like I said, in 1404, we have the very first Welsh Parliament in Machynlleth. And it was also his official crowning. And not only that, he invited huge envoys from Scotland, Castile, France, invited the Irish. And this is when he was officially declared Owain IV, Prince of Wales, Owenes de Gratia Principalia Walia. And it also intended by all major Welsh nobles, even some English nobles who thought maybe Owain was going to succeed.
Hedge your bets, getting good with them.
He unveiled his great seal, like, hey lads, look at this. And it was Glyndŵr armed as a warrior on one side, so he had this side he's a fighter, and on the other side he was seated as a prince with a scepter, orb, and crown on the other. And then he set up a legal system, administration, and treasury. And he no longer saw it as a rebellion. Instead, he was like, no, I'm now a legitimate state. And he set up a Senedd, or parliament. He agreed funds, how they distribute the funds. He hired 60 French ships to protect the coastline, like we said before. The Welsh had no boats. We didn't have boats. We weren't good at that.
Navy,
But he agreed with his noblemen what the money would be spent, and he'd hire 60 ships from the French. His vision for modern Wales, he would have a regular Senedd and a separate Welsh church, separate from the Senedd, so it was church and state. He had 2 national libraries, one in the south, one in the north, and he was going to go back to the equitable laws of Hywel Dda. But at this crowning, there was an assassination attempt on him by David Gam and someone else, and they tried to kill him. Just before he did, they tried to shoot an arrow at him and stab him. But it failed, and Glyndŵr stopped it and burnt down the man's homestead who tried to do it. But importantly, he allowed the man to live because he didn't want to spill any blood on the first day of his parliament, because he thought it would look illegitimate.
Or whatever,
well, more like it would look illegitimate if on the very first day that he'd been crowned Prince of Wales, that he kills someone to become it. It's like, that's the kind of chess he was playing. He wasn't just thinking about the here and now. He was like, I'm going to punish you.
A marketer's mind, this boy. He was like a publicist,
But would someone in Rome think you're legitimate if you killed someone the day you got crowned? So he was like, I won't kill you, I'll burn your livelihood, but you get, I'm not going to let you ruin what my special day. But he didn't know. He literally let the guy live, and he goes back into it later. So, like I said, that's the kind of chess he was playing. He was like thinking so far ahead, and he's always trying to position Wales as a genuine state, and it could be trusted as a stable state.
He was a descendant, I assume, of Morgan Gam, who had tussles with the Clares. Is that right?
You will hear more about Morgan Gam and David Glam and his bastard
Watch
son.
this space. Watch this space.
So Jack was referring to someone from the De Clares lineage, or who are thorns inside of Wales for 300 years.
At least that,
You know the word gammy leg? The saying gammy leg, that comes from
this
him.
family.
But we'll get into that because he comes back. So like I mentioned, Glyndŵr lets David Gam survive because he doesn't want to kill anyone on his day. You come to me on the day of my christening and you do all that stuff. You come to me on the day of my parliament and try to fucking assassinate me. No, I thought you were trying to do Godfather. I was going to say.
I thought that's what you were trying to do.
Yeah, I thought I was, but you sounded like, oh, you fucking bastard! You come to me
you fucking come to me on my fucking day of my fucking parliament,
and I fucking love you. Do you love me?
I love you, Gam. What are you doing?
And then in July the 14th, the Treaty of Alliance with France was signed, with Charles VI acknowledged Glyndŵr as the leader of a free Wales. And then, this is sick, he gifted him a golden helmet, which was the sign of sovereignty, and a breastplate and amazing, one of the best swords they could forge. So the French king, and also France is one of the most powerful parties in the entire world, powerful countries in the entire world. He gets them to bespoke a breastplate and forge a sword just for Glyndŵr plus a helmet.
Very nice.
And it's important to note here that the alliance with the English king, the alliance against the English king, was a pact of alliance just for that. It wasn't against the rest of the world. So say if the Spanish came to fight the French or the Welsh, they weren't duty bound to help each other. This treaty of alliance was simply against the English, right? So that's kind of like centers the focus on it.
Yeah.
There was also in this treaty, which is also so important. This treaty is like genuinely, it legitimizes Wales when the French, who are like, it's the equivalent of like, I don't know, America saying, yeah, hey, we're going to support you. You get that kind of credibility that you'll be by one of the superpowers of the world.
It's massive world stage.
But a part of the treaty, they never specifically mentioned military assistance, but the French would allow aid, economic trade. They'd like support each other. The Welsh would allow the French access to its naval ports. Charles VI also was the former King Richard II. So the guy Glyndŵr who had supported was his father-in-law. So Charles VI was Richard II's father-in-law. So there was a strong connection there and common ground there already. And during this alliance, then the French ordered this guy called Jacques de Bourbon. So do you remember the cider Jacques? Remember that cider?
Yes,
Jacques?
I remember Jacques.
That's how you spell it. And Bourbon is his surname. So he's Jacques de Bourbon. He's a bit of a nightmare, this guy. But the French king ordered him to take a fucking shed load of weapons over to Wales. Like really, the French could just make such better stuff than us. So they made loads of weapons, and they said, "Get over there." They took a French and Brittonic fleet, 20 warships to go support the Welsh.
Wow.
But en route, the Jacques wanted his own fame and fucked it off and attacked Plymouth instead. And they did a land assault. And they attacked Plymouth. They completely sacked it, murdered and raped loads of people there. And then, fearing retaliation, they withdrew to a place called Saint Mao, and they lost 12 ships and all the cargo and most of the men in the storm. So they failed to deliver the weapons.
What are you doing,
I know.
mate?
They missed 800 French knights who were meant to be going there. So then the king was pissed off, and he was like, right, we'll do it again. This time with 60 French warships. But again, they didn't land in Wales, and this time they gave them more leniency to just to harry and harass the English coastlines.
Yeah, just to be a pain in the ass,
Yeah, and often the Welsh troops would be on board, so they'd like attack loads of things, like Cornwall, Plymouth, like all those parts there. There's records of Welsh and French setting fire to Dartmouth and devastated loads of the coast of Devon. So it is mad that you have two countries joining up. Like, I never knew this. Did you know this? Like how involved the French were?
I knew the French were involved in Glyndŵr's thing, but not to like this extent. I did not know that at all. I just thought it was like we'll help you, mate. No worries. Like sort of we'll send letters, and there wasn't really that much. I think I knew about like a little bit of troops being sent over. But I never knew
I
that
had no clue. I had no
all
clue.
these warships and God knows what. Like, it's some bigger scale than I thought.
And during the counter-attack, like attacking Devon, Dartmouth, Plymouth. Anyway, so we've covered now the rise of the rebellion and now the height of like not the height because there's still more to come, but we like a real high watermark. 1400 to 1405. We get to 1406. We're about to end this episode. Wales is now completely exhausted. And I really wanted to kind of hammer this home. We were a small nation now. We were a tiny nation then. And that we have faced onslaught for multiple royal invasions. No landlords are left. There's no one to collect wealth. Crops have been collected. They're all burnt down. Livestock's been slaughtered. Everyone knew. Every single person knew someone who's imprisoned, raped, killed, maimed, starved. There was every single person that was affected by it. There wasn't a single part of Wales that had survived this onslaught. But there was also a massive sense of nationhood. So different from the times of dynastic dynasties of Gwynedd or Deheubarth or Gwent, there was finally a united Wales, which honestly survives to this day because of this. Because this could have all gone. We could have lost what me and you would 100% never we wouldn't be discussing this. We wouldn't be doing Tales for Wales had Glyndŵr not done this, because Wales was on completely petering out.
Like I said, it was only a matter of time before it was just like sort of
you would be
blurred lines, and then the cultural and the linguistic.
You would
stuff
be a
just
maniac to be like, well, give Wales his own government. You know, it's like saying, because it would be, if this hadn't happened, you'd be saying, yeah, but remember back 800 years ago, there was a free Wales. Now you can say there was a Wales so strong that it caused the English, the French, the in a bit, Rome gets involved. It's like, it's crazy how big this gets. Anyway. This is like a story of nationhood, and I completely understand why he's so important.
He's such a big name.
You mentioned before, because you're clever, Clogs, about Glyndŵr's banner, right? And he adopts the same 4 lions, 2 red, 2 gold, on a quarterly field like Llywelyn Fawr and Llywelyn Llywolaf. So you know those things, the lions on these 4 quadrants. But what he does, so those lions are stood on all 4s. He puts the lions rampant, standing up. So on their hind legs with their 2 hands up to illustrate the Welsh had risen. He was like, I'm going to follow Llywelyn Fawr, and I'm having this. And that's when you can always tell whose flag it is, if it's Llywelyn or Glyndŵr's, because Glyndŵr has them ready to fight. And that's such a fucking cool idea.
That is a cool little change, isn't it, to make the rise of the Welsh sort of thing. And
I'll just finish on this, right? Because this period, like I said, we get a lot of the notes here from English chronicles, but because the English are pretty good at archiving stuff, they capture English commanders' letters where they're being besieged and they're begging for support, but often getting ignored. So what I like most was reading these. They've got such funny sign-offs. So they end by saying that one of them ends like Shrewsbury or in Kingston as well. So it was, please pray God send us help, your lowly creature, Richard Kingston.
It's a wretched Kingston, please.
And another one says, I pray that you will not boggle us, but send us warning, short time whether we shall have any help or not, or if there be no help coming, and we must steal away tonight to Brecon, written in haste and red. I
was writing this really quickly. I'm also fucking terrified, mate. So get it to me.
But that ends this episode, which actually meant to be a shorter episode, but it's still 50 minutes long. We now go to the next one, is the battle years. So if you like stories about fights, you've got some fucking battles coming up.
Come back in next week.
You've got the Battle of Shrewsbury, and then some. You've got about 4 battles where Wales is bad than shit. So, thanks so much. This is quite an epic. I feel. I hope you're drinking along with this. I don't know how you'd listen at home. Maybe you save them all up, or you're doing them week by week. But hope you're enjoying them. We got 2 more to go before we end the Glyndŵr series.
Diolch pawb. See you ta-ra.
Should Wales ever meet someone bold, I'll rise up to help them, mind you, I'm 600 years